So let's start. So we are live now, I think. Okay, we are live. So let's start with the first topic of our course, that is API design. So our first topic that we need to start with the basics of API. And starting from the basics of API, first let's think about what do you mean by an API. So let me show you. So this is our API design course, and we going to the next slide. And then, so when we talk about API, the full form of API, the full form of API is application programming interface. So what do you mean by application programming interface? So it's basically is a set of protocols that enable different components to communicate and transfer data. Okay, so let's move to the next slide. So this is the best diagram to explain this API concept. So there is a client here and there is an API here. So the client requests to the API, and that API requests to the API server and asks for some data. And on the basis of that request, the API server responds, and then API responds to the client. So this is basically a request response cycle. So we're going to the next slide. So first let's understand more about API. So first, okay, so basically we have a client and we have a server. So client sent a request to the server, and that server respond to the client. So this is basically two-tier architectures where a client and server, and in between client and server there is a protocol which is known as which is known as API. So this is client and this is server. And in between we have API to easily communicate between the client and server. So this client requests to the server, request to the API, and then this API asks a request to the server, then this server respond to the API, and that API respond to the client. So basically it is a request response protocol. So we can see that an API which stands for application programming interface is a set of protocols that enable different software components to communicate and transfer data. So its main work is basically the communication between the client and the server. So the main work of I can say the main work is basically communication. So API provides a protocol that helps to communicate between the server and client. So now we can understand about API and how so the next thing in our mind. So the first question I think clear, like what do you mean by this API term? And next we will discuss about how this API work. And before going to the how, we need to go to the basics of API, or we can say basic components of API. So for that topic, we again go to the slide and go to how do API works. So before this, yeah, so there is a client we already know about. So there is okay, this is also the definition and how that API work by sharing data between application system and devices. We already discussed about about these lines. This happens through a request and response cycle. I already discussed about this. The request is sent to the API, which retrieves the data and return it to the user. Here's a high level overview of how that process works. First, we already know about API client. So API client is responsible for starting the conversation by sending the request to the API server. The request can be triggered in many ways. For instance, a user might initiate an API request by entering a search term or clicking a button. API request may also be triggered by external events such as a notification from another application. So this is our first component, that is client. API is responsible, you already know about that. API start with the client, like client is responsible for starting the conversation. They send the request to the API server. If that client is not requesting anything, then the API server or API never respond. So the request can be triggered in many ways. For instance, a user might initiate an API request by entering search term or clicking a button. API request may be triggered. So there are many ways to trigger that. So the next thing, that is API request. An API request will behave differently depending on the type of API. It will typically include the following components. So these are some components. So these are some components that we need to talk. The first component is endpoint. So an endpoint is a dedicated URL that provides access to a specific resource. For instance, the articles endpoint in a blogging app would include the logic for processing all requests that are related to articles. So I can say that URL provides access to a specific resource. So this is an endpoint. After that, we have second thing, that is known as method. The request method indicates the type of operation the client would like to perform. On a given resource, REST API are accessible through standard HTTP methods which perform common actions like retrieving, creating, updating, and deleting data. So basically, the request method indicates the type of operation, like what we need to do that. Either we need to create, update, and delete data or retrieve data. On the basis of that performance, we use some methods. After 1-2 lectures, we also start the method topic again, and we go deep to that to this topic method, like we have different type of methods like get, we have get, we have post, we have put, we have delete. So these all are method which used to perform these operations. So these are some parameters. Parameters are the variables that are passed to an API endpoint. So these are some important parameter that we need to send to the API server to to request some data. And we have request headers. So basically headers are key value pairs that provide extra details about the request, such as its content type or authentication credentials. Then we talk about request body. So request body is basically what we request. The body is the main part of the request and it includes the actual data that is required to create, update or delete a resource. For instance, if you were creating a new article in a blog app, the request body likely include the following content type, content title and author. So this is some basic of an API: endpoints, methods, parameters. After that, we have API server. The API client sends the request to the API server, which is responsible for handling authentication, validating input data, and retrieving or manipulating data. So after that API server, the API server give a response to me. Give a response, and that finally the API server sends a response to the client. The API response typically includes the following components, like we have status code. In next lectures we will definitely talk about status code, response header and response body. So basically in today's lecture we are only talk about some basic of API, and on next lectures, when we go to the next lectures, we will definitely talk about all these points or all these topics. So the next slide, it's what are the benefits of an API. So before moving to this topic, I am showing something to you. I'm showing something. So let's test some API. I say testing API. So we have some let's check this API. So I'm making a collection in API. So I'm basically using an app which is known as Postman. So Postman helps for API testing. So I already run this app. This is Postman. So I'm creating a new collection where I add a request, and in this request I'm pasting my URL. So this is an endpoint. This is a request HTTPS methods like get, post, put, patch, delete, head. These are all HTTPS methods. We have headers, we have authorization, we have body. So in this and this in this, so So I'm sending a request to this API server, this endpoint API server. I'm sending a get request to get the data or retrieve the data from API server. So I'm sending a request. Then so this is status code. This shows that the request is successful and the server has responded as required. So the server is responding a JSON type data, a array of JSON type data. This is an array of JSON type data. So in headers, I can show you headers. We have key value pair, but in this HTTPS method or to run this endpoint, we don't need any type of headers and authorization as well, and any types of parameters or body. So this is the basic example of how the HTTPS method work, how this endpoint work, how we send a request to the server, and how to get response from the server. This is the status code. We have lots of status code like 404 for not found, or 400 error for the bad request. If somebody is not requesting the right way or right parameters headers, then this show 400 bad request. In next lectures we will show you how all methods will work and how all HTTPS method will work. So this is all about today's lectures, but we have left some topic. Let's complete this and after that we will move. So I already done how to API work. Basically we study about the parts of the API. So we are here status code. I already talk about status code, 3-digit code that indicate the outcome of an API request. Some of the most common status code include 200 OK, which indicate that the server successfully returned the requested data. 201 for created, which indicates the server successfully created a new source. And 404 for not found, which indicates that the server could not find the requested resource. And for the next, that is response headers, are very similar to request header, except they are used to provide additional information about the server response or response body. So what are the benefits of API? You already know about API. So the main benefit is allowing them to communicate with one another. This unlock many benefits ranging from enhanced user experience to increase with efficiency. Then automation. API can be used to automate repetitive time consuming work so that human can focus on more complex tasks. This improves productivity, especially for developer and testers. Then innovation. So it helps to innovate something. Like public APIs can be used by external engineering teams, which spurs innovation and accelerate development by enabling developers to repurpose existing functionality to create new digital experience. Then security. API can provide an additional layer of protection against unauthorized data breaches. Then cost cutting. Definitely API provides access to useful third-party tools and infrastructure, which helps businesses avoid the expense of building and complex in-house terms. So this is all about today's class. Then in next class we talk about types of APIs and some use cases of APIs.